compared to an average of 4% in the British-owned islands. The media of the day often supported business against its detractors, as happens today. While Adam Smith wrote of the superior treatment of plantation workers by the French, it was a fantasy, and the mortality rate of slaves proves it. 0.61 survey shows a plantation going through 4 times its original slave population. This means that the act of killing 80% of one's workforce through harsh treatment was somehow acceptable in sugar plantation economics. Workers were poorly housed and underfed. The food for slaves was often the stockfish brought in on the 4,000 or more American ships that registered in St. Domingue. The American ships were mostly from New England, and returned with sugar and molasses. The American ships also traded slaves. Industry in New England and France prospered as those who engaged in slave trading plowed their profits into the factories, the railroads, and the mines. In order for a small population to control such a large population, violence was commonplace. For a minor infraction, whipping and the application of salt and pepper in the wounds was typical. Branding, mutilation, and death were typical as well. A runaway slave could expect to be hamstringed. The act of eating sugar cane was punished by being forced to wear a metal muzzle. Women could be raped without recourse. Documented cases exist in which disobedience was curtailed by nailing a man by the ear to an object, and in one case a slave's ears were cut off, cooked, and forced upon him as food. Common slave tortures included spraying the slave with boiling wax or cane syrup, sewing the lips together with wire, binding men glazed with molasses in the paths of ants, and sexual mutilation. Death for slave traders 187 was a blessing to many, and hundreds committed suicide to avoid being burned alive, or hanged by the planters and their overseers. 7 The Perkins family plantation might have been typical of any St. Dominguean plantation. Although lucrative for the owners, it was living hell for those forced to work for them. In the memoir of Thomas Handacid Perkins, Thomas Perkins spared future readers the details of the sugar plantation business and his participation in the slave trade. Instead, his memoirs simply mention that the Perkins brothers had a house, or company, in Haiti, but found the climate not agreeable, and so returned to Boston. 8 The climate Perkins referred to was a revolution of the black slaves against the white overlords, in which 2/3 of the whites were killed or forced to flee, and 1/3 of the blacks were killed. It was the third in the series of revolutions, starting with the American Revolution, which then spread to France, and to St. Domingue. The Perkins family, and it says survived the carnage, and became pillars of New England society. The slave trade was not invented by the Perkinses, or even by the New England merchants. Instead it had existed in Europe, Africa, and Asia for thousands of years. Europe's involvement in the African trade, however, did grow and thrive after coming under the control of the post-Templar military orders. Chapter 11 Red Cross and Black Cargo. Modern history attributes the beginning of the European slave trade in America to the Portuguese. The Knights Templar, reincorporated in Portugal as the Knights of Christ, were under the control of Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese Grand Master, who saw an economic opportunity developing as the Reconquista. The reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula pushed the Arabs out of Iberia. Henry didn't invent the institution of slavery. It was already thousands of years old when he became master of his order. But Henry did modernize slavery so that he could incorporate it into his quest for new lands, just as he had incorporated the trade in a number of other commodities. He licensed slavery. He developed a system in which the trade would grow, and he could collect royalties from it. Yet slavery as an institution is as old as civilization. Prince Henry and the Knights of Christ improved the trade and institutionalized the business, but neither Henry nor the Knights can shoulder the blame for inventing slavery. Aristotle wrote that humanity is made up of slaves and masters. Plato, who believed no honest man could ever be rich, saw nothing dishonest about the slave trade and believed only in regulating its role in the marketplace. Pre-Christian Rome employed slaves in gullies and the proverbial salt mines, where they worked under horrid conditions. Roman Christianity did not question the slave trade, as yielding to Caesar's decisions was still the rule. The barbarian Alaric raided Rome 188 Red Cross and Black Cargo 189 with the aid of 40,000 captured slaves. Later Anglo-Saxons and Vikings traded white slaves who had been captured in raids and war. In Ireland, slave girls were an actual unit of exchange or currency, and were valued more highly than male slaves. 1. In an early version of Enlightenment, Venice was one of the first city-states to ban slavery, in AD 960. The military orders and the slave trading prospered all the way through the spread of Islam. While Europe participated in the age-old institution, it used mostly white slaves from European lands that had been conquered, rather than African slaves. The Arabs simply made the slave trade more international. When the tide turned against Islam, the Italian merchants, and then the fighting Crusader orders stepped into the trade. In fact, Italian ship owners had a reputation for simply selling a boatload of passengers to an Arab trader. Such acts led to Templar ships being considered safer from the passengers' viewpoint, as the Templars were more likely to protect their pilgrim passengers. Later the Templar orders and the Knights of St. John joined the slave trade to fund their operations. In Iberia, the Arabs used black slaves to cultivate the land, and to fight against the Christians. During the Reconquista, much land was given to the military orders, including those of Calatrava, Alcantara, and Aviz of Spain and the Knights of Christ in Portugal. Estates were also given to the Cistercian order of monks, who saw no moral conflict in cultivating the land with slave labor. 2. With the Arab invaders mostly pushed out of Europe, the Templars' chief business became business. When the Templars were suppressed, the order underwent both a name change and a management change. The Knights of Christ recreated the Knights Templar at their worst. They became an international business cartel with the approval of the government. Henry and his intrepid explorers understood the opportunity to profit by taking over the lucrative slave trading business. They then licensed the trade for royalties and ships of the order and ships owned by others, but licensed 190 from the sacred to the profane through the order soon plied the seas from Angola to the slave coast, buying or stealing slaves from the Arab merchants. Henry the Navigator had the benefit of being highborn. As the third son of King John I of Portugal and Queen Philippa of Lancaster, Henry was given the title of Grand Master of the Knights of Christ. The Knights were one of 4 military orders in Portugal, all of which were the remnants of the Knights Templar, which had been disbanded by the efforts of the King of France and the Catholic Pope. While the French knights were arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake, the Portuguese knights simply changed their name, and were born again with the blessing of Pope John XXII. The knights kept their wealth, their status, and even their regalia. A red cross on a white field. Although he was called the Navigator, Prince Henry did very little navigating. He did, however, pilot his order from a castle in Sagres, Portugal, where he gathered all the nautical wisdom of his day. He improved on the nautical instruments, gathered maps and perfected the art of cartography, developed new vessels such as the caravel, a small, graceful, 2-masted ship built to navigate shallow seas and make long-distance crossings, and trained would-be mariners to sail. Henry's navigators, possibly with the aid of ancient maps, soon rediscovered Atlantic islands such as the Azores and Madeira, and then set their sails toward Africa. In 1441 Henry's first caravel reached Africa and returned with black slaves. The trade was not new to Africa. Black tribes had enslaved each other for thousands of years. The Islamic Berbers and Arab Moors then took over the trade. The costs of outfitting a fleet and a world-class university at Sagres were great, and the sugar trade with Madeira and the slave trade would defray some of the high costs of maintaining both. Henry also had agricultural projects,